Someone is poisoning you. Daniel Carter looked up from his breakfast plate, the butter knife still in his hand, and frowned slightly as if he had misheard. "What did you say?" he asked. "What are you talking about? Is that some kind of joke?" Annie stood at the edge of the breakfast table, holding a glass of water with both hands. She shook her head quickly. "It's not a joke, sir," she said in a small voice. "Please don't eat the bread. The one with butter on it. Don't eat it." Daniel stared at her for a moment, confused, then gave a short, uncertain laugh. "Annie, that's a very strange thing to say in the morning." He replied, "Why would you say someone is poisoning me?" Annie stepped closer and placed the glass of water next to his plate. Then she leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "I saw her last night." Annie whispered, "I saw Miss Victoria in the kitchen. She was crushing pills and mixing them into the butter. She put the butter back in the fridge and smoothed the top so no one would know." Daniel's smile disappeared, but he still shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "No, Annie, you must have misunderstood. Victoria wouldn't do something like that. She's going to be my wife." Annie looked at the toast, then back at him. "Sir, please don't eat it." Daniel sighed and put the knife down. "Annie, listen to me," he said gently but firmly. "This is very serious. You can't say things like that about people, especially not about someone in this house. Are you sure you didn't see something else? Vitamins, medicine for a headache?" Annie shook her head again, more urgently this time. "No, sir." She had a small white bottle. She crushed the pills with a spoon and mixed them into the butter. "I was standing right there. She didn't know I was there at first." Daniel leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, still not fully believing her. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then why would she do that? And why would she let you see it?" Annie hesitated, then looked down at her hands. Her voice became even quieter. "Because she saw me," Annie said. "I dropped a spoon and it made a noise. She turned around and saw me standing by the door." Daniel felt a small uncomfortable feeling in his chest, but he still wasn't ready to believe it. "And then what?" he asked. Annie swallowed. "She didn't get angry," she said. "She smiled and called me over. She knelt down and told me that sometimes grown-ups have secrets." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "What else did she say?" Annie looked up at him. "She gave me money," she said, "a lot of money. She said if I didn't tell anyone what I saw, she would give my mom enough money so she wouldn't have to work as a cleaner anymore. She said we could move to a better place. She told me it was just medicine to make you sleep more and that I shouldn't worry." Daniel's face slowly lost all expression. "She tried to buy your silence?" he asked quietly. Annie nodded. "Yes, sir. I told her okay, but I didn't mean it." Daniel was silent for a few seconds. Then he looked at the toast again, the butter melting slowly into the bread. "This is a very big accusation, Annie," he said. "You understand that, right? I can't just believe something like this without proof." Annie looked at him for a moment, then said something that surprised him. "Then make her eat it," Annie said. Daniel blinked. "What? Tell Miss Victoria to eat the bread?" Annie said, pointing at the toast. "If I'm lying, then it's just bread and butter. Nothing will happen, but if I'm telling the truth, she won't eat it." Daniel stared at her. The kitchen was very quiet now. "You want me to ask my fiancée to eat my breakfast to test if she's trying to poison me?" he asked slowly. Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." Before Daniel could say anything else, they heard the sound of high heels coming down the hallway. Annie immediately stepped back and lowered her head, pretending to look at the floor. Victoria walked into the kitchen, smiling like every other morning. "Good morning," she said brightly. "You're still not done with breakfast." Daniel looked at the toast, then back at Victoria. For a brief moment, Annie's words echoed in his mind. "If I'm telling the truth, she won't eat it." Victoria walked over and looked at the plate. "You're going to be late if you don't eat," she said. "Eat while it's warm." Daniel picked up the slice of toast slowly and held it in his hand. "You're right," he said. "Actually, why don't you have a bite first?" Victoria frowned slightly. "Me? Why would I eat your breakfast?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "I don't know. You're always telling me to eat. Maybe you should try it first and show me how good it is. Victoria laughed a little, but there was a tightness in her smile now. Daniel, don't be silly. I already had yogurt earlier. It's just one bite, Daniel said, still calm. Humor me. Victoria didn't reach for the toast. I said, I'm not hungry, she replied. You eat it. Daniel held the toast out a little closer to her. Just one bite, he repeated. For a split second, something changed in Victoria's eyes. It was very fast. So fast that if Daniel had not been watching carefully, he might have missed it. She took a small step back. No, she said a little too quickly. I told you I'm not hungry. The room became very still. Daniel slowly lowered the toast and placed it back on the plate. Then he looked at Victoria, his face calm, but his eyes completely different now. Okay, he said quietly. I'll eat later. Victoria studied his face as if trying to figure out what he was thinking. Then she smiled again, but this time the smile looked like something she had to put on, not something that came naturally. Fine, she said, but don't forget, you need your strength. She turned, picked up her handbag from the counter, and walked toward the door. I'm going out for a few hours, she said. Wedding planner, then the spa. I'll see you this afternoon. Drive safe, Daniel said. When the front door closed and her car pulled out of the driveway, Daniel did not move for a long time. Then he slowly sat down in his chair again and looked at Annie. The little girl was staring at the plate. You saw that, didn't you? She asked quietly. She wouldn't eat it. Daniel didn't answer right away. He reached for a napkin, picked up the toast without touching it, and placed it carefully into a plastic bag. Then he opened the butter dish, looked at it for a few seconds, and closed it again. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a cold edge to it now. Annie, he said, from this moment on, you don't tell anyone what you told me. Not even your mother. Do you understand? Annie nodded. Daniel sealed the plastic bag and set it on the counter. Do you know what you did this morning? He asked. Annie shook her head. You may have just saved my life, Daniel said quietly. Annie was silent for a moment. Then she said something in a small, serious voice that sounded far older than 6 years old. I didn't do it because you're rich, she said. I did it because she tried to buy me. And my mom says, people who try to buy children are never good people. Daniel looked at her for a long time and slowly nodded. That night, Daniel Carter did not go to bed at his usual time. Around 9 o'clock, he heard Victoria's car pull into the driveway. A few minutes later, the front door opened and closed, followed by the familiar sound of her heels on the wooden floor. She appeared at the study door a moment later, smiling. You're still working? She asked gently. You really need to learn how to rest, Daniel. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a long moment before answering. Come in, he said. I want to ask you something. Victoria stepped into the room, her expression calm, curious. That sounds serious, she said lightly. What is it? Daniel gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down. She sat, crossing her legs elegantly. You're making me nervous, she said with a soft laugh. Daniel folded his hands on the desk and looked straight at her. His voice when he spoke was calm and even. Is there anything you want to tell me? He asked. Victoria blinked once. I'm not sure what you mean. Daniel held her gaze. Anything at all, he said. Something you've been hiding. Something I should know before we get married. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. Then she smiled again, the same warm, reassuring smile he had trusted for over a year. Daniel, she said softly. Why would you ask me that? Of course there's nothing. What is this about? He leaned back slightly as if embarrassed. Maybe I'm just tired, he said. Running a company makes you suspicious. You start to think everyone wants something from you. Victoria relaxed a little and reached across the desk, placing her hand over his. I'm not everyone, she said. I'm the woman who loves you. Daniel looked down at her hand on his, then back up at her face. I know, he said quietly. I just needed to hear you say it. She smiled. You're working too hard. That's all this is, stress. After the wedding, things will be different. You won't have to carry everything alone anymore. He nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. They talked a little longer about the wedding, about the guest list, about a charity dinner they were supposed to attend the following week. Victoria was calm, affectionate, completely normal. If Daniel had not seen the way she refused the toast that morning, if Annie had not spoken, he would have believed every word. After Victoria went to bed, Daniel picked up his phone and called Frank again. I need two things, Daniel said quietly. First, I want the butter tested as soon as possible. Not just for sleeping pills, for anything hard medication, sedatives, anything that could cause long-term damage if taken in small doses. I'll take it to a lab first thing in the morning, Frank said. What's the second thing? I want you to pull the security footage from the kitchen last night, Daniel said, between midnight and 2 a.m. You have the footage stored locally or on the cloud? Frank asked. Both, Daniel replied, but I don't want anyone in the house system to know I'm accessing it. I'll download it myself tonight and bring it to you. After he hung up, Daniel walked to the small security room near his study. Most people who visited his house thought the room was just a storage closet. Only a few people knew it contained the central security system for the entire property. He closed the door behind him and turned on the monitors. Camera 3, kitchen. He scrolled back to the previous night, 12:47 a.m. The screen showed the dark kitchen, lit only by the small under-cabinet lights. A minute passed. Then the door opened and Victoria walked in. Wearing a silk robe, Daniel felt his chest tighten as he watched the screen. Victoria walked to the counter, opened her purse, and took out a small white bottle. She looked around once as if making sure she was alone. Then she took a spoon from the drawer, placed something on the counter, and began crushing it carefully. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. She opened the butter dish, crushed pills into the butter, stirred slowly, carefully. Then she used the back of the spoon to smooth the surface so it looked untouched. After that, she closed the butter dish, put the bottle back into her purse, turned off the small light, and left the kitchen. Daniel did not move for a long time. He replayed the video once, then again, then a third time, watching every movement, every detail, every moment of her face. She knew exactly what she was doing. Daniel finally turned off the monitor and stood there in the dark security room, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. For the first time since his wife had died years ago, he felt that same cold, hollow feeling in his chest. The feeling that the world you thought you were standing on was not solid ground at all. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. He returned to his study and sat down heavily in his chair. A few minutes later, there was another soft knock on the door. Sir. Annie's voice came from the other side. Are you awake? Yes, Daniel said. Come in. Annie stepped inside, holding her stuffed rabbit again. She looked at his face and immediately knew something had changed. You saw the camera, didn't you? She asked quietly. Daniel nodded once. Yes, he said. I saw everything. Annie was silent for a moment. I told you the truth, she said softly. I know, Daniel replied. He looked at the small girl standing in the middle of his study, the only person in the house who had told him the truth. Annie, he said, his voice calm, but different now, harder, more focused. From now on, we have to be very careful. She thinks you took the money and stayed quiet. We have to let her keep thinking that. Annie nodded slowly so she doesn't know that you know exactly. Daniel said, tomorrow morning, everything will be normal. I will eat breakfast. I will go to work. I will talk about the wedding. I will smile and she will think her plan is working. He paused, then added quietly. And while she thinks she's winning, we're going to find out everything. Annie held her stuffed rabbit tighter. Are we going to catch her? She asked. Daniel looked toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, his eyes cold and steady. Yes, he said quietly. We are. The next morning, the house looked exactly the same as it always did. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. The coffee machine hummed softly. The smell of toasted bread and fresh coffee filled the air, warm and familiar, like nothing in the world had changed. But Daniel Carter knew something had. He walked into the kitchen wearing a dark suit and a calm expression. The same expression he used before major negotiations. Victoria was already there standing at the counter spreading butter on a slice of toast. She turned and smiled when she saw him. "Good morning," she said. "I made breakfast early today. I thought you might actually eat with me for once." Daniel smiled back. "That's a rare honor," he said. His eyes moved just for a second to the butter dish. The same white porcelain dish. The same smooth surface. If he had not seen the video the night before, he would have seen nothing at all. "Coffee?" Victoria asked. "Please," he said. She poured him a cup and placed it in front of him, then slid a plate with 2 slices of toast toward him. Both slices were neatly buttered. "I made sure you ate today," she said lightly. "No excuses." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down. "You're taking very good care of me lately," he said, looking up at her. Victoria leaned one hip against the counter and smiled. "Someone has to," she replied. "You work too hard. You forget to eat. You forget to sleep. If I don't take care of you, who will?" Daniel held her gaze for a moment. "That's a good question," he said quietly. She didn't seem to notice anything strange in his tone. She walked around the counter and sat across from him with her own cup of coffee. "You have your meeting this morning?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "And a call with the lawyers this afternoon." "The lawyers," she repeated, her tone casual. But her eyes sharpened just slightly. "What for?" Daniel picked up his coffee and blew on it slowly before answering. "Just updating some documents," he said. "Company structure, board voting rights, things like that." Victoria nodded slowly. "You never stop, do you?" she said. "Even your paperwork has paperwork." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you build something big. You spend the rest of your life protecting it. And who protects you?" she asked softly. Daniel looked at the toast in front of him. The butter glistened slightly under the kitchen lights. "That," he said, "is also a very good question." At the far end of the kitchen, Annie was wiping the counter, quiet, careful, not looking at either of them. But Daniel could feel that she was listening to every word. Victoria picked up her coffee again. "Eat," she said gently. "It's getting cold." Daniel picked up one slice of toast. He held it in his hand, studying it for a brief moment, then looked up at Victoria. "You know," he said casually. "I was thinking last night." "About what?" she asked. "About trust," he said. "About how strange it is that we trust people with our lives without ever really testing that trust." Victoria laughed lightly. "You sound like a philosopher this morning." "Do I?" Daniel said. "Let me ask you something." "All right," she said, amused. "What is it?" "If you thought someone was trying to hurt me," Daniel said slowly, "would you tell me the truth, even if it was dangerous for you?" Victoria looked at him, her expression soft, almost offended. "Of course I would," she said. "Why would you even ask that?" Daniel nodded as if satisfied with the answer. Then he held up the slice of toast slightly. "Then you won't mind helping me with something," he said. Victoria tilted her head. "Helping you with what?" "Eat this," Daniel said, holding the toast out toward her. "Just one bite." Victoria didn't move. For a second, the entire kitchen seemed to freeze. Even the sound of the coffee machine stopping felt loud. She looked at the toast, then at Daniel, and smiled as if she thought he was joking. "Very funny," she said. "Eat your own breakfast." "I will," Daniel said calmly. "Right after you take one bite." Victoria's smile stayed on her face, but her eyes changed. "Daniel," she said softly. "What is this? Some kind of test?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "Maybe," he said. "Humor me." Victoria leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Now, I told you. I already ate earlier," she said. "I'm not hungry. It's just one bite," Daniel repeated. "If there's nothing wrong with it, then it shouldn't matter." The words hung in the air between them. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed again, but this time the laugh sounded thin. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "I'm not eating your toast, Daniel." Daniel slowly lowered the slice of bread and placed it back on the plate. Okay, he said quietly. Then I won't eat it either. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. What is going on with you? She asked. First, you skipped breakfast yesterday. Now this. You're acting very strange. Am I? Daniel said. I feel perfectly normal. No, you don't. She said. You're testing me. I can see it, but I don't understand why. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. Let me ask you one more question, he said. And this time, I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Victoria didn't speak. Is there anything you want to tell me? Daniel asked quietly. Before we get married, anything at all. Her face went completely still. I already answered that question last night, she said slowly. No, there's nothing. Daniel nodded once as if he had expected that answer. All right, he said. Then we're done with this conversation. He stood up, picked up his coffee, and carried it to the sink, pouring the rest of it out. Then he turned back to her. I'm going to the office, he said. I might be late tonight. Don't wait up. Victoria stood up too. Daniel, she said, her voice tight now. You're scaring me. Did I do something wrong? He looked at her. Really? Looked at her as if trying to see the woman he thought he loved and the woman he saw on the security footage at the same time. No, he said quietly. Not yet. He picked up his car keys and walked toward the door. As he passed Annie, he said in a normal voice, "Thank you for cleaning the kitchen." Yes, sir, Annie said softly when the front door closed behind him and the sound of his car faded down the long driveway. Victoria stood in the kitchen without moving. Slowly, she turned her head and looked at Annie. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Victoria walked toward her, her heels clicking slowly on the floor, her face no longer warm, no longer kind. She stopped in front of Annie and spoke in a low, cold voice. Did you say something to him? She asked. Annie shook her head immediately. No, ma'am. Victoria stared at her for a few seconds, searching her face for something. Fear, guilt, anything. Then she reached into her purse, took out another envelope, thicker than the first one, and placed it on the counter in front of Annie. You're a smart girl, Victoria said quietly. Smart girls know when to stay quiet, and smart girls know when an opportunity can change their lives. Annie looked at the envelope, but did not touch it. Victoria leaned closer and said one more thing, her voice barely above a whisper. Because if you're not a smart girl, she said, this house can become a very difficult place for your mother to work. Then she straightened up, smiled again like nothing had happened, and walked out of the kitchen. Annie stood there alone, staring at the envelope on the counter, her hands slowly curling into fists. Upstairs, in his car at the end of the driveway, Daniel Carter sat behind the wheel, but did not start the engine right away. He was looking at his phone at the message Frank had just sent. The lab received the butter. Preliminary result. Contains a beta blocker compound in abnormal dosage. Long-term use in high dose can cause severe heart failure. Daniel read the message twice, then a third time. Outside his windshield, the morning looked bright and peaceful like any other day. But Daniel now knew the truth with absolute certainty. The woman he was going to marry was trying to kill him, and the war inside his own house had just begun. Daniel did not go to the office that morning. He drove out of the gate, turned the corner as if he were heading toward the highway, then parked his car under a row of tall trees where the house could not be seen from the road. He turned off the engine and sat there in silence, both hands resting on the steering wheel, his mind moving faster than it had in years. He had built companies from nothing. He had survived lawsuits, hostile takeovers, market crashes, and men who smiled while trying to ruin him. In his world, when someone tried to destroy you, you didn't panic. You gathered information, you stayed calm, and you let the other side believe they were smarter than you. He picked up his phone and called Frank. I got the preliminary lab result, Daniel said. And Frank asked, there's a beta blocker compound in the butter. Daniel said in abnormal dosage enough to cause heart failure over time. Frank was quiet for a moment. So the kid was telling the truth. Yes, Daniel said, she was. You understand what this means, right? Frank said. This isn't an accident. This is premeditated. Slow poisoning is hard to detect unless someone is looking for it. Daniel looked out through the windshield at the long road ahead of him. She doesn't want a scandal, he said. She wants a funeral. So, what's the plan? Frank asked. Daniel was silent for a few seconds before answering. In business, when someone is trying to steal your company, you don't confront them immediately. You watch who they talk to. You follow the money. You find out who else is involved. You think she's working with someone? Frank asked. I don't think she's smart enough to plan all of this alone. Daniel said there's money involved, insurance, legal documents, timing. Someone is advising her. Frank nodded. All right, I'll start digging into her finances, phone records, everything I can find. But Daniel, if she's willing to poison you, she's willing to do worse if she thinks you're onto her. I know, Daniel said. That's why she can't know. He ended the call and sat there for another minute, then started the engine again. This time, he drove back toward the house. When he walked into the kitchen, it was quiet. Too quiet. Annie was standing by the counter, exactly where he had left her earlier, the envelope still lying in front of her. She looked up quickly when he entered. You came back, she said, surprised. Daniel nodded and walked over to the counter. He looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. Did she say anything else to you after I left? He asked. Annie nodded slowly. She asked if I told you something, Annie said. I said, no, and then she gave me more money, Annie said, looking at the envelope. She said, smart girls know when to stay quiet. And she said, this house can become a very difficult place for my mother to work if I'm not smart. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. She threatened your mother. Annie didn't answer, but her eyes filled with fear for just a second before she looked down again. Daniel picked up the envelope and weighed it in his hand. It was thick, very thick. He opened it and looked inside. Cash, more money than Annie's mother probably made in several months of cleaning houses. He put the money back in the envelope and set it down on the table. Leave it there, he said. Don't spend it. Don't move it. It's evidence now. Evidence, Annie repeated. It means proof, Daniel said. Proof that she tried to pay you to stay quiet. Annie nodded slowly. Are you going to tell the police now? Not yet, Daniel said again. We still don't know everything. I want to know who is helping her. And I want proof that no one can argue with. He walked to the fridge, opened it, and looked at the butter compartment. There were 2 butter dishes inside. Now, the poisoned one he had already removed and a new one Victoria must have bought that morning. She replaced it, he said quietly. Annie walked closer. So, she knows you didn't eat it, she said. Yes, Daniel replied, and that makes her nervous. Nervous people make mistakes. He closed the fridge and leaned against the counter, thinking. Listen to me carefully, he said, looking at Annie. From now on, nothing changes. You take the money. You act like you believe her. You act like you're on her side. Annie's eyes widened. You want me to pretend to help her? Yes, Daniel said, because if she thinks you're on her side, she'll talk in front of you. She'll make phone calls. She'll tell you things she shouldn't tell anyone. Annie was quiet for a long moment. That's lying, she said. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, he said. It is, and I don't like it. But sometimes when someone is doing something very wrong, the only way to stop them is to let them think you don't see what they're doing. Annie looked at the envelope again. I don't like her, she said quietly. I know, Daniel replied. Neither do I, not anymore. He walked to the sink and poured himself a glass of water, then drank it slowly. When he set the glass down, his hands were steady again. His mind was clear. Here's what's going to happen. He said, tonight, I'm going to tell her that I went to the doctor because I've been feeling tired. I'm going to tell her the doctor thinks I might have heart problems. Annie looked up quickly. So, she thinks the poison is working. Exactly, Daniel said. If she believes it's working, she'll get comfortable. And when people get comfortable, they get careless. He walked back to the table and looked at the envelope one more time. Do you know why people like her always lose in the end? He asked. Annie shook her head. Because they think money makes them smarter than everyone else, Daniel said. They think poor people don't see anything. They think children don't understand anything. They think kindness is weakness. He paused, then added quietly. They're wrong. At that moment, they heard the sound of Victoria's car returning to the driveway much earlier than expected. Annie looked at Daniel, her eyes suddenly nervous. She's back, she whispered. Daniel's face changed instantly, all emotion disappearing, replaced by the calm, polite expression he wore in public. Remember, he said quietly. You didn't tell me anything. You took the money. You're scared. You want to protect your mother. That's the story now. Annie nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. The front door opened. A moment later, Victoria walked into the kitchen, her eyes moving immediately from Daniel to Annie to the envelope on the table. She smiled slowly. Well, she said softly. I see you found my little gift. Annie looked down, playing her part. Yes, ma'am, she said quietly. Victoria looked at Daniel. You're home early, she said. I thought you had meetings all day. Daniel loosened his tie slightly and gave a tired smile. I didn't feel well, he said. So, I went to see a doctor. Victoria's eyes sharpened. A doctor? Why? Daniel walked to the chair and sat down heavily like a man exhausted. He says, my heart isn't doing so well, Daniel said quietly. Too much stress, too many years of work. He wants to run more tests. Victoria didn't speak, but for the first time since Daniel had known her. He saw something she could not hide fast enough. Happiness. It flashed across her face for less than a second. But Daniel saw it, and in that moment, he knew something with absolute certainty. This was no longer just suspicion or fear or doubt. This was war. Victoria did not mention Daniel's heart problem again that evening, but everything about her changed in small, almost invisible ways. She became kinder than usual. She asked him twice if he needed anything. She offered to cook dinner herself instead of letting Annie's mother handle it. She even brought Daniel a glass of water and reminded him to take the vitamins she placed next to his plate. Daniel noticed everything. He noticed how she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. He noticed how she checked whether he finished his food. He noticed how she casually asked what time he would leave for work the next day and what time he would be home. She was building a schedule in her head, a timeline. Later that night, Daniel sat in the living room pretending to read while Victoria sat on the sofa across from him with her laptop open, looking at wedding venues. Soft piano music played in the background, something slow and expensive sounding. This one is beautiful, Victoria said, turning the screen toward him. It's a vineyard in Napa. Very private, very elegant. We could have the ceremony outside at sunset. Daniel looked at the photos and nodded. It's nice, he said. Nice, she repeated with a small smile. I'm planning our wedding, Daniel. You're supposed to say it's perfect. He looked at her and smiled faintly. It's perfect, he said. She studied his face for a moment, then closed the laptop. You seem very calm for a man who was just told he might have heart problems, she said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. When you build companies for a living, you learn to live with bad news, he said. Markets crash, partners leave, lawyers call. You get used to the idea that everything can disappear very quickly. Victoria tilted her head slightly. That's a very dark way to look at life. It's a very realistic way, Daniel replied. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and walked behind his chair, resting her hands lightly on his shoulders. You're not going to disappear, she said softly. I'm here now. You're not alone anymore. Daniel looked straight ahead, not moving. Yes, he said quietly. That's what I used to think, too. Victoria's hands paused for a fraction of a second. Then she leaned down and kissed his cheek. Get some rest, she said. You look tired. After she went upstairs, Daniel waited exactly 10 minutes. Then he stood up, turned off the lights, and walked quietly down the hallway toward the back staircase that led to the staff area of the house. He knocked softly on the small door near the kitchen. Annie opened it almost immediately, as if she had been waiting. "Sir," she said, "can we talk?" Daniel asked. She nodded and stepped aside so he could come in. The small staff kitchen was warm and smelled faintly of dish soap and rice. Annie's mother was already asleep in the next room after a long day of work. Daniel sat down at the small table, which looked almost too small for a man like him, a man who owned boardrooms and buildings and companies. "Has she said anything else to you today?" he asked quietly. Annie nodded. "She asked me if you ate all your food." Annie said. "I told her yes." "Good." Daniel said that was the right answer. Annie hesitated, then added. "She also asked me what time you went to bed last night and what time you woke up this morning." Daniel nodded slowly. "She's trying to learn my routine." He said she wants to know when I'm alone, when no one is around, when something can happen and look like an accident. Annie looked down at her hands. "She scares me," she said quietly. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said something very calm, very steady. "She should be scared of you." Annie looked up, surprised. "Me?" "Yes," Daniel said, "because you're the only person in this house she couldn't control. She tried money. Now she's trying fear. That means she doesn't know what to do with you." Annie didn't look convinced. "I'm not strong," she said. Daniel shook his head. "Strength isn't about size," he said. "It's about what you do when you're scared. And you told the truth even when she offered you more money than you've probably ever seen in your life." He leaned forward slightly. "That's strength." Annie was quiet, thinking about that. "Tomorrow," Daniel continued, "I'm going to start acting sicker, more tired. I might pretend to feel dizzy. If she thinks the medicine is working, she'll speed things up." "Speed things up," Annie repeated. "Yes," Daniel said. "People like her don't like to wait too long. Waiting makes them nervous. And nervous people make mistakes." Annie thought for a moment. "What if she tries something faster?" she asked quietly. "Not the butter. Something else." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm worried about." He reached into his pocket and placed a small object on the table. It looked like a simple keychain. "What's that?" Annie asked. "It's a panic button," Daniel said. "If you ever feel like you're in danger, you press this. It sends a signal to a security company I use. They'll call me and the police immediately." Annie looked at the small device, but didn't touch it. "You think she would hurt me?" she asked. Daniel didn't lie. "I think she would hurt anyone who could destroy her plan," he said. Annie slowly picked up the keychain and held it tightly in her hand. "Sir," she said after a moment. "Why is she doing this? You're nice to her. You were going to marry her." Daniel leaned back in the chair and looked at the small ceiling light above them. "When I was young," he said slowly, "I thought people did bad things because they were poor or desperate or uneducated. But I've met a lot of rich people in my life, Annie. Very rich people. And I learned something." "What?" Annie asked. "Some people don't want money because they need it," Daniel said. "Some people want money because it makes them feel powerful. And power is like a drug. Once someone wants it badly enough, they stop caring who gets hurt." Annie was quiet for a long time after that. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Daniel stood up from the small table. "Now," he said, "we wait. We watch. And we let her believe that everything is going exactly the way she planned." He walked to the door, then stopped and looked back at Annie. "But remember this," he said quietly. "From this moment on, everything in this house is a performance. Every meal, every conversation, every smile. We are on a stage now." Annie nodded slowly. "And her?" Annie asked. Daniel's face became very still. "She thinks she's writing the story," he said. "But she forgot something very important." "What?" Annie asked. Daniel looked at the small panic button in Annie's hand, then back at her. "She's not the only one who knows how to plan." The next 2 days passed in a strange, quiet tension that never left the house. Daniel began to play his role carefully. On the first morning, he walked into the kitchen a little slower than usual. He sat down, pressed his fingers lightly against his chest once, as if testing a small pain, then forced a smile when Victoria looked at him. "You look tired," she said immediately. "Didn't sleep well," Daniel replied. My heart was racing a little. Last night, Victoria's eyes flickered. Just for a second, concern appeared on her face, but it was the kind of concern that came too quickly, like a switch being turned on. Did you call the doctor? She asked. I have another appointment tomorrow. Daniel said. More tests. She nodded and turned back to the counter. You should eat something, she said. You need strength. I will, Daniel replied. He watched carefully as she prepared breakfast. She moved naturally, confidently, like someone who had done this many times before. She took out eggs, bread, fruit, and the new butter she had bought. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Annie stood near the sink, drying dishes that were already dry. Her eyes occasionally lifting just enough to see what Victoria was doing. Victoria placed a plate in front of Daniel. Toast, eggs, fruit. Eat while it's warm, she said gently. Daniel picked up his fork and ate slowly. Very slowly. He made sure to eat some of the eggs and fruit, but he barely touched the toast. Victoria noticed. You're not eating the toast again, she said, her voice light but her eyes sharp. Doctor says I should cut down on butter. Daniel replied without looking up. Cholesterol. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. Your doctor is trying to take all the joy out of your life. She said. First stress. Now butter. Daniel smiled faintly. I never liked toast that much anyway. He said he could feel her watching him, measuring something in her mind. Later that afternoon, Daniel stayed home instead of going to the office. He told Victoria he was waiting for a call from the doctor. Instead, he was in his study with Frank, who had arrived quietly through the back entrance. Frank was in his 60s, with gray hair, a lined face, and the patient eyes of a man who had spent his life watching people lie. Daniel showed him the security footage. Frank watched the video once, then again, then leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. That's as clear as it gets, he said, crushing pills, mixing them into butter. No jury in the world would misunderstand that. I want to know who she's working with, Daniel said. And I want to know how long this has been going on, Frank nodded. I started looking into her finances, he said. On paper, everything looks normal, but there are some large transfers over the past 6 months. Money coming in from a consulting company I've never heard of. Name? Daniel asked. Frank opened a small notebook. Redwood Strategic Consulting. Daniel frowned slightly. I don't know that company. I didn't think you would, Frank said. It's a shell company. No real office. No employees listed, but money moves through it. A lot of money. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Follow the money, he said. That's where the truth always is. Frank nodded. There's something else, he added. She took out a life insurance policy on you 3 months ago. Daniel looked up slowly. How much? 5 million, Frank said. And she's the primary beneficiary. Daniel let out a quiet breath through his nose. Not surprise. Confirmation. 3 months, Daniel said. That's about when she started insisting on making breakfast herself. Frank closed the notebook. Daniel, you need to be very careful. He said if she has money coming in a life insurance policy. This isn't just a bad idea. This is a business plan. Daniel gave a humorless smile. I know. I've written business plans before. At that moment, there was a soft knock on the study door. Both men looked up. Sir. Annie's voice came through the door. She's on the phone in the garden. She said she didn't want to take the call inside. Daniel and Frank exchanged a quick look. That's new, Daniel said quietly. He stood up immediately. Stay here, he told Frank. Daniel walked quietly through the hallway and out the side door that led toward the garden. He moved slowly, staying behind the tall hedges until he could hear Victoria's voice. I told you. He went to the doctor. Victoria was saying, they think it's his heart. He's tired all the time now. He barely eats. It's working. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. No, not yet, Victoria said. We can't rush it. If he dies too suddenly, people will ask questions. It has to look natural. Stress, heart failure. He's 40. He works too much. It's believable. Another pause. Yes, I know about the insurance, she said. I'm not stupid, but the company is worth much more than that. Once we're married, I get control until everything is transferred. That's the real money. Daniel stood very still behind the hedge, listening to the woman he was supposed to marry calmly discuss the timeline of his death. I said, I'm handling it. Victoria continued, her voice lower now. Just make sure the paperwork is ready. When it happens, I don't want any delays with the accounts. She ended the call and stood there for a moment, looking out across the garden, peaceful and beautiful in the late afternoon sun. Daniel stepped back quietly before she could see him and walked back toward the house, his face expressionless. When he returned to the study, Frank looked up immediately. Well, she's not working alone, Daniel said. There's someone else, and they're already planning what happens after I die. Frank's jaw tightened. Did she say who? No, Daniel said, but she mentioned paperwork, accounts, transfers. This is about control of the company, not just the insurance. Frank nodded slowly. Then we don't just need to catch her poisoning you, he said. We need to catch the whole plan. Daniel walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Victoria had been standing just minutes ago. Good, he said quietly. Because I don't just want to survive this. He turned back to Frank, his eyes cold and focused. I want to destroy their entire plan. That night, Daniel did something he had not done in years. He opened a locked drawer in his study and took out a thin black notebook. Inside were handwritten notes, names, numbers, and observations. The kind of notebook a man keeps when he has learned that memory alone is not enough in a world where people lie. He wrote one name at the top of a blank page. Victoria Lang. Under it, he began to write everything he knew so far. Life insurance policy, $5 million, 3 months ago. Shell Company, Redwood Strategic Consulting, unknown owner, phone call, male partner, discussing timeline, accounts, transfer, after death, poison, beta blocker, slow heart failure, witness, Annie, bribery, cash envelope, threat, Annie's mother's job. He put the pen down and looked at the page for a long time. This isn't just murder, he said quietly. This is a takeover. Frank, sitting across from him, nodded. Yeah, he said. They don't just want you dead, they want everything you built. Daniel closed the notebook. Then we make sure they don't get it. The next morning, Daniel changed his routine again. Instead of going straight to the office, he called his lawyer, Margaret Lewis, and asked her to meet him for a private lunch. Margaret had been his legal advisor for almost 15 years. She was in her late 50s, sharp, calm, and almost impossible to intimidate. They met at a quiet restaurant that didn't attract business crowds. Margaret took one look at Daniel's face and said, "This is not a social lunch, is it?" "No," Daniel said, "it isn't." He didn't tell her everything. Not yet, but he told her enough. "I want to change my will," Daniel said. "And I want to change who has temporary control of the company if something happens to me." Margaret didn't look surprised. She just nodded and took out a pen. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you want changed." "If I die," Daniel said, "I don't want Victoria to have control of the company. Not even temporarily. Everything goes into a trust. You and Frank will be co-executives. No major decisions, no sale of shares, no transfer of control for at least 1 year after my death." Margaret looked at him carefully. "That's very specific," she said. "Are you expecting to die soon, Daniel?" Daniel met her eyes. "I'm expecting someone might be planning for me, too," he said. Margaret didn't ask any more questions. She had worked with powerful people for too long to be shocked easily. "I'll prepare the documents," she said. "But if this is what I think it is, you need to be very careful." "I know," Daniel replied. When he returned home that afternoon, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. He was starting to hate the silence of his own home. He found Annie in the kitchen sitting at the small table doing homework. She looked up when he walked in. "Did you find out who she was talking to?" Annie asked immediately. "Not yet," Daniel said. "But we're getting closer." He sat down across from her. "Did she say anything today?" Annie nodded. She asked me if you took your medicine. Annie said. Daniel frowned. What medicine? She said she might start giving you special vitamins because the doctor said your heart is weak. Annie said. She told me if she ever gives me a glass with a pill in it, I should make sure you drink all of it. Daniel felt a slow, cold anger move through him. She's changing the plan, he said quietly. The butter was too slow now. She wants something faster, something she can control directly. Annie looked scared again. What are we going to do? Daniel leaned forward slightly. We're going to give her what she wants, he said. Opportunity. That evening at dinner, Daniel played his role better than ever. He looked tired. He moved slower. Twice, he pressed his hand lightly against his chest as if something hurt. Victoria noticed everything. You don't look well, she said softly. I think the doctor is right. You need to rest more. Daniel nodded. I was thinking the same thing, he said. I might take a few days off. Stay home. No office. Victoria's eyes lit up for just a second before she hid it behind concern. That's a good idea, she said. You need someone to take care of you. Daniel looked at her. That's what I was thinking. He said, I trust you. She reached across the table and took his hand. You can always trust me, she said. Daniel looked down at her hand holding his and thought. You're going to regret saying that. After dinner, Victoria went into the kitchen to make tea. Annie was already there drying dishes. Annie, Victoria said gently. Daniel is very sick. We have to take good care of him now. Yes, ma'am, Annie said quietly. Victoria took a small bottle from her purse and placed it on the counter. These are the vitamins I told you about, she said. The doctor said they will help his heart. Tomorrow morning, I'll show you how many to put in his drink. Annie looked at the bottle. Yes, ma'am, she said. Victoria leaned down slightly so they were eye level. Her voice became very soft, very serious. You're doing the right thing, she said. When all of this is over, your mother will never have to work for anyone again. You'll go to a good school. You'll have a different life. Annie didn't answer. Victoria smiled and picked up the bottle again. We're going to help him rest, she said. That's all. From the hallway, Daniel stood in the shadows, listening to every word. He watched as Victoria placed the bottle back into her purse and walked past him without noticing he was there. Daniel remained in the dark hallway for a long time after she left. Then Annie slowly stepped out of the kitchen and looked at him. You heard, she whispered. Daniel nodded. She wants me to put the pills in your drink tomorrow, Annie said. What do we do? Daniel's face was calm now. Completely calm. The calm of a man who had finally stopped hoping this was all a misunderstanding. Tomorrow, he said quietly. We give her exactly what she wants. He looked toward the stairs where Victoria had disappeared. And tomorrow, he added, she makes her biggest mistake. The next morning felt different from the moment Daniel opened his eyes. It was the kind of feeling you get before a major deal closes or before a storm arrives. The air feels normal. People speak normally, but somewhere underneath everything, something is about to change. He dressed more slowly than usual and deliberately left his tie slightly loose, his shirt collar open as if he didn't have the energy to care. When he walked down the stairs, he paused halfway and pressed his hand lightly against the wall, breathing a little heavier on purpose. Victoria was in the kitchen. Annie stood near the counter, very still, like someone waiting for instructions. Victoria turned when she heard Daniel's footsteps. Her face immediately filled with concern. You shouldn't be walking around, she said, walking quickly toward him. You look pale. I'm fine, Daniel said, though he made sure he didn't sound fine. Just a little dizzy. She took his arm and guided him to the chair at the breakfast table. Sit, she said softly. I'll bring you something. Daniel sat down slowly. He could feel Annie watching him, waiting for a sign, waiting to know what to do. Victoria poured a glass of orange juice. Then she reached into her purse and took out the small pill bottle Annie had told him about. She opened it, shook 2 small pills into her hand, and looked at Annie. Come here, Victoria said gently. I'll show you. From now on, every morning, you put 2 of these in his juice. They dissolve very fast, so he won't even notice. Annie walked closer, her face carefully blank, her hands steady, even though her heart was racing. Yes, ma'am, Annie said quietly. Victoria dropped the pills into the orange juice. They fizzed slightly, then disappeared. See, Victoria said, very easy. This will help his heart relax. Daniel watched the entire thing without moving, his face tired, his eyes half-lidded like a man who didn't have the strength to pay attention. Victoria picked up the glass and placed it in front of him. Drink, she said softly. It will make you feel better. Daniel looked at the glass. Then he looked at Annie for a fraction of a second. Their eyes met. Annie's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the counter. Daniel picked up the glass. He raised it halfway, then paused and looked at Victoria. Can you get me my phone from the living room? He asked. I think I left it on the sofa. Victoria hesitated for just a second, then nodded. Of course, she said. Drink while I get it. She walked out of the kitchen. The moment she disappeared into the hallway, Daniel stood up quickly and carried the glass to the sink. He poured the orange juice down the drain, then filled the glass again with fresh juice from the fridge. He turned to Annie. Did you see how many pills she used? He asked quietly. 2, Annie said. Like she said. Daniel nodded. Good. Remember that. He placed the clean glass back on the table and sat down again just as Victoria returned with his phone. Here, she said, handing it to him. Did you drink it? Daniel picked up the glass and drank the fresh juice in 3 slow swallows, then set the empty glass down. Victoria watched him carefully. Good, she said softly. You'll start feeling better soon. Daniel wiped his mouth with a napkin. I already feel better, he said. And for the first time since this began, that part wasn't a lie because now they had moved from suspicion to action. Now she was actively trying to poison him in front of a witness. That changed everything. Later that afternoon, Frank returned with more information. They sat in the study again. The door closed, voices low. I found out who owns Redwood Strategic Consulting, Frank said. And Daniel asked. Frank slid a piece of paper across the desk. On it was a name. Michael Trent. Daniel looked at the name and felt something twist in his chest. I know him, he said quietly. Yeah, Frank said. I figured you did. He used to be one of your partners, didn't he? Daniel nodded slowly. 10 years ago, he said, we started a company together. I bought him out when we disagreed about the direction of the business. He wanted fast money. I wanted to build something long-term. Frank crossed his arms. Looks like he still wants fast money. Daniel looked at the paper again. He knows my company. He knows the structure, the shares, the board, the insurance policies. He would know exactly what happens if I die. Frank nodded. Which means this whole thing, the insurance, the marriage, the poisoning. It's not just her idea. It's a plan they built together. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. 10 years, he said quietly. 10 years ago, I trusted him. Now he's planning my death with the woman I was going to marry. Frank didn't say anything. After a long silence, Daniel sat up again. His face had changed. The last bit of shock was gone now. What remained was focus. Tomorrow, Daniel said, we record everything. Frank nodded. Audio video both. Daniel said, I want her on camera giving the pills. I want her voice on recording talking about my heart, about the plan, about everything. I want something so clear that when the police see it, there's no way out. Frank leaned forward slightly. You're sure you want to go that far? Daniel looked at him, his eyes cold and steady. She decided to kill me slowly, Daniel said. She decided to use a child to help her do it. She threatened that child's mother. She planned to take everything I built and celebrate at my funeral. He paused, then said quietly, yes, I'm sure. That evening, Daniel called Margaret, his lawyer, and told her one more thing. If anything happens to me, he said, there's a folder in my study labeled insurance. I want you to open it immediately and take it to the police. Daniel, Margaret said, her voice tight with concern. What exactly are you involved in? Daniel looked out the window into the dark garden where Victoria was walking, talking on her phone again, her voice too low to hear. I'm involved, he said quietly, in finding out who the person sleeping in my bedroom really is. When he hung up, he remained standing by the window for a long time. Upstairs, Victoria was probably choosing wedding flowers, looking at dresses, planning music for a ceremony that was never going to happen. Downstairs, Annie sat at the small kitchen table doing homework, a panic button on a keychain beside her hand. And Daniel Carter stood in the middle of his own house and realized something that most people never have to realize. The most dangerous place in the world is not a dark alley or a bad neighborhood. The most dangerous place in the world is a home where the person trying to kill you knows exactly when you wake up, what you eat, and when you go to sleep. And tomorrow, he was going to make sure she said everything out loud. That night, Daniel did not turn on the lights in his study. He sat in the dark listening to the quiet sounds of the house and waited for Frank to finish installing the small cameras. "They're tiny," Frank whispered, standing on a chair near the bookshelf. "One in the kitchen facing the table, one near the counter, and one in the hallway. Audio is already running through the security system." Daniel nodded. "Make sure the kitchen camera can see the glasses clearly," he said. "I want to see the pills go in." Frank adjusted the angle slightly. "You're sure you want to do this tomorrow?" he asked. "Once she does it on camera, there's no going back." Daniel stood by the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his face calm in the darkness. "There was no going back the moment she crushed those pills into the butter," he said. Frank climbed down from the chair. "All right," he said. "Then tomorrow, we let her try again." After Frank left through the back entrance, Daniel walked slowly into the kitchen. The house felt different now, like a stage set before a play, everything arranged, everything waiting. He stood by the table where he had eaten breakfast every morning for years. He ran his hand across the back of the chair, then looked toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. "This used to be my favorite room," he said quietly to himself. "Now it feels like a trap." A soft sound made him turn. Annie was standing in the doorway holding a glass of water. "I saw the man earlier," Annie said quietly. Daniel frowned slightly. "What man?" "The one she talks to on the phone," Annie said. "He came today when you were out. They talked in the garden." Daniel's expression changed immediately. "Did he see you?" Annie shook her head. "I was inside. I heard them through the open window." "What did they say?" Daniel asked. Annie tried to remember. "He said something about papers," she said slowly. "And signatures." Daniel felt a cold anger settle deeper inside him. "Did she say anything?" Annie nodded. "She said, you went to the doctor and the doctor thinks your heart is weak. She said, maybe a few more weeks." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. A few more weeks. They were scheduling his death like a business meeting. "Did you see his face?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Annie said. "He's tall, gray hair. He looks like someone important." "He wasn't scared at all. He was laughing." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know who he is," he said. "And that's good. That means we know both of them now." Annie stepped into the kitchen. "Are they going to try again tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "And tomorrow we're going to make sure we have everything we need." The next morning, Daniel made sure everything happened exactly as Victoria expected. He walked slower. He coughed once. He even held the railing when he came down the stairs. Victoria was already in the kitchen. And when she saw him, her face filled with that same careful concern. "You should still be in bed," she said. "You look worse today." "I didn't sleep," Daniel said, which was true. "My chest felt tight." Victoria walked closer and touched his arm gently. "Sit," she said. "I'll bring you juice." Annie stood near the counter, very quiet, watching everything. Victoria poured orange juice into a glass, then took the small pill bottle out of her purse again. This time, she didn't even try to hide it. She opened the bottle, shook 2 pills into her hand, and looked at Annie. "Go ahead," Victoria said. "You do it today." Annie froze for a fraction of a second, then nodded. She took the pills with slightly shaking fingers and dropped them into the juice. They dissolved quickly, just like the day before. "Good," Victoria said. "You see, Very easy. This is how we help him. Daniel sat at the table, watching like a tired man who didn't have the strength to pay attention. But inside, every second was sharp and clear. Victoria picked up the glass and placed it in front of him. Drink, she said softly. Daniel reached for the glass, but this time he didn't drink immediately. He looked up at Victoria instead. Sit with me, he said. I don't want to sit alone. Victoria smiled and sat across from him. Daniel held the glass in his hand and looked at the orange liquid for a long moment. Then he said something very quietly. You know, he said, when my first company almost went bankrupt, I thought that was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. Victoria didn't respond. She was watching the glass. But I was wrong, Daniel continued. Losing money is not the worst thing that can happen to a man. He looked up at her. The worst thing, he said, is realizing that the person sitting across from you is not the person you thought they were. Victoria's eyes flickered slightly. What do you mean? She asked carefully. Daniel held her gaze for another second. Then he smiled faintly and lifted the glass. Nothing, he said. I'm just tired. And then he drank. He drank the entire glass slowly while Victoria watched. When he finished, he set the empty glass down on the table and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment like a man who was exhausted. Victoria watched him very carefully. Do you feel okay? She asked. Daniel nodded slowly. Just tired, he said. I think I'm going to lie down. I'll help you upstairs, she said quickly. Daniel stood up, but as he did, he swayed slightly on purpose. Victoria immediately put her arm around him, supporting him as they walked toward the stairs. Behind them, Annie stood in the kitchen, her heart pounding, her hands cold. She knew something. Victoria did not know. The glass Daniel had just drunk from was not the one with the pills. When Victoria turned to get a napkin, Daniel had switched the glasses. Upstairs, Victoria helped Daniel lie down on the bed. You should rest, she said softly. I'll check on you later. Daniel closed his eyes and nodded like a man too weak to argue. Victoria stood beside the bed for a few seconds, watching him, waiting to see if the pills were already working. Daniel slowed his breathing, making it deeper, heavier, like someone falling into a deep sleep. After a minute, Victoria smiled. She leaned down, kissed his forehead gently, and whispered, "It will be over soon." Then she turned and walked out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her. The moment the door closed, Daniel opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade down the hallway. Then he spoke very quietly to the empty room. "Yes," he said, "it will." Daniel did not move for a full 5 minutes after Victoria left the room. He lay on his back, eyes half closed, breathing slow and heavy, listening to the house. He heard her footsteps go down the hallway, then the stairs, then the faint sound of dishes in the kitchen. She was calm, unhurried, confident. She thought it was working. Daniel slowly opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. There was no panic in him now, no fear, just a cold, clear focus. He sat up carefully and reached into the drawer of his nightstand, pulling out a small device Frank had given him the night before. It looked like a simple remote, but when he pressed the button, it activated the audio recording system installed in the kitchen and hallway. If Victoria said anything now, they would have it. Daniel stood up slowly and walked to the bedroom door, opening it just enough to leave a small gap. Then he lay back down on the bed but kept his eyes open, watching the line of light from the hallway across the floor. Downstairs, Annie was in the kitchen when Victoria walked in. "Is he asleep?" Victoria asked. "I think so," Annie said quietly. "He looked very tired." Victoria nodded and walked to the counter. Annie watched as she took the pill bottle out again and set it on the table. "You did very well this morning," Victoria said. "You see how easy this is. You're helping him rest. You're helping him stop hurting." Annie didn't answer. Victoria leaned against the counter and crossed her arms, looking toward the stairs as if she could see through the ceiling. "It won't be much longer," she said quietly. Almost to herself. "A few more days, maybe a week. His heart is already weak." The doctor confirmed it, didn't he? Annie remembered what Daniel told her. Act normal. Let her talk. Yes, ma'am, Annie said softly. He said his chest hurts. Victoria smiled slightly. Good, she said. That means it's working. The words hung in the air, cold and ugly. Annie felt her hands shake, but she kept her eyes on the floor so Victoria wouldn't see her face. What happens after? Annie asked quietly, like a child asking an innocent question. Victoria looked at her and studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. After, she repeated. Then she smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile anymore. After everything changes, she walked slowly around the kitchen, speaking in a calm, thoughtful voice. This house will be mine, she said. The company will be mine to control until everything is transferred. There are shares, accounts, properties, more money than you can imagine. Your mother won't have to scrub another floor for the rest of her life. And you, she looked at Annie, you'll go to a private school. You'll have nice clothes, a different life. Annie swallowed. And Mr. Daniel, she asked quietly. Victoria looked toward the ceiling again, toward the bedroom upstairs. He's tired, she said softly. Men like him work too much. Stress kills people like him every day. It will be sad, of course. Very sad. She placed a hand over her heart, pretending. But life goes on. Upstairs, Daniel lay on the bed, listening to every word through the small earpiece connected to the recording system. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since this began, the anger he felt was so strong he had to force his hands to relax. Downstairs, Victoria sat at the kitchen table and opened her phone. I need to make a call, she said. If anyone asks, I'm not here. Yes, ma'am, Annie said. Victoria dialed and turned slightly away, but her voice was still clear enough for the microphones. It's me, she said. He drank it this morning. The girl is doing exactly what we need. He's getting weaker. A man's voice answered on the other end. Faint but audible. How long? Soon, Victoria said. He almost fainted this morning. A few more doses and we won't have to wait much longer. And the documents? The man asked. I'm working on it, Victoria said. He's already talking about changing paperwork because of his health. I'll make sure I'm in control before anything happens. You'd better, the man replied. We didn't come this far to lose everything. We won't, Victoria said. Once he's gone, the company will be under my control. Then we move the shares, sell what we need, and we're done. And the kid? The man asked. There was a small pause. Victoria looked over at Annie, who was standing by the sink with her back turned. The kid likes money, Victoria said quietly. And her mother needs the job. They won't be a problem. Upstairs, Daniel opened his eyes again and stared at the ceiling. The kid likes money. He almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about any of this. Downstairs, Victoria ended the call and stood up. She walked over to Annie and placed her hand lightly on the girl's shoulder. You're doing the right thing, she said. Remember that. You're helping him and you're helping your mother. Annie nodded, still not turning around. Victoria picked up her purse and headed toward the stairs. I'm going to check on him, she said. Upstairs, Daniel quickly closed his eyes again and slowed his breathing just before the bedroom door opened. Victoria walked in quietly and stood beside the bed, looking down at him. She watched his face, his chest rising and falling slowly, his arm lying weakly across the blanket. She reached out and touched his forehead gently like a loving fiancé. You should have just married me and trusted me, she whispered softly. It would have been easier for you. Daniel did not move, did not react, did not open his eyes. After a moment, Victoria smiled to herself, turned, and walked out of the room again, closing the door softly behind her. The moment she left, Daniel opened his eyes, and sat up. He reached to the nightstand, picked up his phone, and pressed one button. Frank answered immediately. You got it? He asked. We got everything, Daniel said quietly. Video, audio, her voice, his voice, the plan, the motive, everything. There was a short silence on the line. What do you want to do now? Frank asked. Daniel stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out over the property he had spent half his life building. Tomorrow night, Daniel said, his voice calm and final. We end this. The next day moved slowly, like time itself was being careful. Daniel stayed in bed longer than usual, making sure the performance continued. When he finally came downstairs late in the morning, he walked like a man who hadn't slept, one hand occasionally touching his chest, his breathing just a little heavier than normal. Victoria noticed immediately. You shouldn't be out of bed, she said, walking quickly to him. You look worse today. I feel worse, Daniel said quietly. The doctor called this morning. He wants more tests. He said, my heart rhythm is irregular. Victoria's face filled with perfect concern, but her eyes were alive with something else. Something bright and hungry. That sounds serious, she said softly. Daniel nodded and sat down slowly at the table. I've been thinking, he said. If something happens to me, I don't want to leave things messy. Victoria didn't speak, but she sat down across from him, listening very carefully now. I built everything from nothing, Daniel continued. The company, the investments, the foundation, all of it. If I die suddenly, the board will panic. The lawyers will fight. The state will freeze accounts until the will is clear. It will be chaos. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Well, handle it, she said gently. You won't be alone in this. Daniel looked at her. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, he said. I want you to be protected. If something happens to me, I don't want you fighting with lawyers and board members. Victoria's heart was beating faster now. But she kept her voice calm. What are you saying? I'm saying, Daniel replied slowly, that tonight I want you and one other person to come to dinner. Someone who understands business. Someone who can help you if I'm not around. Victoria's mind immediately went to one person, Michael Trent. She tried not to react too quickly. Who did you have in mind? She asked carefully. Daniel shrugged slightly. I was thinking Michael Trent, he said. We had our differences, but he understands the company. If you ever needed advice, he would know what to do. For a fraction of a second, Victoria forgot to breathe. Daniel watched her closely. He saw the surprise, the calculation, the excitement. She tried to hide. That's actually a very good idea, she said slowly. I can call him. Good, Daniel said. Invite him for dinner tonight. 7 o'clock. Victoria nodded. I'll call him right now. She stood up and walked quickly toward the hallway, already taking her phone out of her purse. Daniel sat at the table, his face calm, but inside, everything was moving into place. Across the kitchen, Annie stood very still, watching him. Tonight, she whispered when Victoria was out of the room. Daniel nodded once. Tonight, he said quietly. It ends tonight. Are you scared? Annie asked. Daniel thought about it for a moment. No, he said, not scared, just disappointed. That afternoon, the house was cleaned more carefully than usual. Victoria told Annie's mother to prepare a nice dinner steak, roasted vegetables, salad, wine. She even changed the table settings to the more expensive plates they only used for important guests. It looked like a celebration. At 6:58 that evening, a black car pulled into the driveway. Annie was in the hallway when the doorbell rang. She opened the door and saw a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and an expensive coat. He smiled when he saw her, but it wasn't a warm smile. Good evening, he said. Is Mr. Carter home? Yes, sir, Annie said quietly. Please come in. Michael Trent stepped into the house like a man who already owned part of it. Victoria came down the stairs a moment later, dressed elegantly, smiling brightly. Michael, she said warmly. Thank you for coming. Of course, Michael said. When you said it was important, I was curious. Daniel walked into the room slowly as if he were tired and extended his hand. Michael, he said, it's been a long time. Michael shook his hand. Too long, he said. You don't look well, Daniel. Daniel smiled faintly. I don't feel well, he replied. That's actually why I invited you. They sat at the dining table. Victoria poured wine. Dinner was served. From the outside, it looked like 3 successful adults having a quiet, elegant dinner. But under the table, Daniel could feel the small recorder taped beneath the wood. In the living room, Frank and two police officers sat in silence, watching the live camera feed from the kitchen and dining room on a laptop. Dinner went on for about 20 minutes before Daniel put his fork down and looked at Michael. "I'm going to be direct," Daniel said. "My health is not good. The doctors are worried about my heart. If something happens to me, Victoria will be alone and the company will be complicated." Michael nodded slowly. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, though he didn't look sorry at all. "I want you to help her," Daniel continued. "I want you to help her manage things, the shares, the accounts, the transition." Victoria looked down, pretending to be emotional. Michael took a sip of wine. "That's a big responsibility," he said. "Why me?" Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly. "Because if I die, I know you and Victoria will already know what to do. You've been planning it for months." The room went completely silent. Victoria's head snapped up. Michael's hand froze around his wine glass. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at both of them, his eyes no longer tired, no longer weak. "I know about the butter," he said calmly. "I know about the pills. I know about the insurance policy. I know about Redwood Strategic Consulting. And I know about the phone calls in the garden." Victoria's face went white. Michael slowly put his wine glass down. "Daniel," he said carefully. "You sound very confused." Daniel pressed a small remote in his hand. In the living room, Frank nodded to the officers from the speakers in the dining room. Victoria's voice suddenly filled the air. "He drank it this morning. The girl is doing exactly what we need. He's getting weaker. A few more doses and we won't have to wait much longer." Victoria stared at the speaker, her face frozen in horror. Then Michael's recorded voice followed. "Once he's gone, the company will be under your control. Then we move the shares, sell what we need, and we're done." The recording stopped. For a long moment, no one moved. Daniel looked at them both and said quietly, "Dinner is over." At that exact moment, the front door opened and Frank walked in with two police officers. Victoria stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "Daniel, I can explain." "No," Daniel said calmly. "You can explain to them." The police officers stepped forward. Victoria Lang, Michael Trent, one of them said. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and attempted poisoning." Victoria looked at Annie, who was standing in the hallway, small and silent. "Watching everything. It was you," Victoria whispered, her voice full of hatred. "You stupid girl. You ruined everything." Annie didn't move. She didn't look away. Daniel stepped between them. "No," he said quietly. "You ruined everything. The moment you thought you could buy a child's silence and poison a man at his own breakfast table, you ruined everything yourself." For a moment after the police officer spoke, no one moved. Victoria stood frozen beside the dining table, her face pale, her eyes wide, as if her mind could not accept what was happening. Michael Trent, on the other hand, did not look shocked for long. Men like him recovered quickly. Men like him always believed there was still a way out if they could just talk long enough. "This is a misunderstanding," Michael said, standing up slowly and raising his hands slightly as if he were calming a room during a business negotiation. "Officers, I think we need to slow down. No one here is trying to hurt anyone." One of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, please put your hands where I can see them." Michael forced a small smile. "Of course," he said. "I'm just saying this is a private conversation that's being taken out of context." Victoria suddenly found her voice. "Daniel, please," she said, her tone changing instantly from cold to desperate. "You don't understand. It's not what it sounds like. I was trying to help you. The medication, it was supposed to help your heart." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and there was something like sadness in his eyes now, not anger. "You were crushing beta blockers into butter," he said quietly. "Without telling me, without a prescription, without a doctor, and you told your partner on the phone that a few more doses and I would be dead." Victoria shook her head quickly. "No, I said you would be resting. You're twisting my words." At that moment, Frank walked into the dining room and placed a small recorder on the table. He pressed a button. Victoria's voice filled the room again, clear and unmistakable. His heart is already weak. A few more doses and we won't have to wait much longer. Then Michael's voice. Once he's gone, the company will be under your control. Then we move the shares, sell what we need, and we're done. Frank turned the recorder off. The silence that followed was heavy and final. One of the officers stepped behind Michael and began to cuff his hands. Michael Trent, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and financial fraud. Michael didn't resist, but his eyes moved to Daniel. You think you've won, he said quietly. You think this makes you smart? Daniel didn't answer. The other officer approached Victoria. Victoria Lang, please turn around and put your hands behind your back. Victoria didn't move. She was staring at Daniel, her eyes filling with tears now. Daniel, she whispered, please. I loved you. I did. You have to believe that. I wouldn't really have let you die. Daniel looked at her and spoke very calmly. You were planning my death while picking out wedding flowers, he said. You were discussing my funeral like it was a business meeting. Tears ran down Victoria's face now, but her voice suddenly hardened. You were a lonely man with too much money. She said, do you know how easy you were to fool? Charity events, sad stories, acting like I understood your long nights and your stress. You wanted someone to admire you. I just gave you what you wanted. The officer stepped closer. Ma'am, turn around. Victoria slowly turned and allowed the officer to cuff her hands, but she kept her eyes on Daniel. You think you're better than everyone, she said coldly. But you're just like every other rich man. You think money makes you safe. It doesn't. It just makes you a target. As the officers began to lead Michael and Victoria toward the door, Victoria suddenly turned her head toward Annie, who was standing in the hallway, small and silent, watching everything. This is your fault, Victoria said sharply. Do you know what you've done? Do you know how much money you just threw away? You and your mother could have had a completely different life. Annie didn't move. She didn't look away. She just stood there, her hands at her sides, looking at Victoria with a calm expression that didn't belong on a child's face. My mom says, Annie said quietly, money that comes from hurting people is not a blessing. It's a curse. Victoria stared at her, her face twisting with anger. You stupid child, she said. You chose loyalty over money. That's why people like you stay poor. Before Annie could answer, Daniel spoke. No, he said calmly. People like you are the reason the world needs loyalty. Victoria looked at him one last time. But this time there was no charm left, no kindness, no pretending, just anger and something close to hatred. Then the officers led her out of the house. The front door closed, and just like that, the house was quiet again. But this time it was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of secrets and poison and lies. The quiet of something ending. Daniel stood in the middle of the dining room for a long time without moving. The table was still set. 3 wine glasses, half-finished plates, a dinner that had started like a celebration and ended like a courtroom. Frank walked back into the room and looked at Daniel. You did the right thing, he said. Daniel nodded slowly. I know, he said, but he didn't sound like a man who felt like he had won. After a moment, he walked into the hallway where Annie was still standing. It's over, he said gently. Annie looked toward the door where the police had taken Victoria. Is she going to jail? She asked. Yes, Daniel said. She and Michael both are. Annie was quiet for a moment. Are you sad? She asked. Daniel thought about the question carefully before answering. Yes, he said, but not because she's gone. I'm sad because I didn't see who she really was. I'm sad because I almost trusted the wrong person with my life. He looked down at Annie. But I'm also grateful, he said. Because someone in this house told the truth when it mattered. Annie looked at the floor. I was scared, she said. I know, Daniel replied. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you do the right thing even when you are. At that moment, Annie's mother came into the hallway confused and worried after seeing the police cars outside. What's happening? She asked. Is everything okay? Daniel looked at her and spoke gently. Everything is okay now, he said. And I think it's time we talked about a better future for you and your daughter. One that no one has to lie or hide or be afraid to have. He looked around the house, the walls, the stairs, the dining room, the kitchen, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt like his again. Not because he owned it, but because the people who wanted him dead were finally gone. The house felt unfamiliar the morning after the arrests, not because anything had changed physically. The same sunlight came through the windows. The same coffee machine hummed in the kitchen. The same long driveway stretched beyond the front gate. But something invisible had lifted from the walls, like a storm that had passed during the night. Daniel woke early and went downstairs. For the first time in many days, he was actually hungry. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at the table, the counter, the refrigerator, ordinary things that had almost become weapons. He opened the fridge, took out eggs, and started cooking breakfast himself. A few minutes later, Annie walked into the kitchen and stopped when she saw him at the stove. "You're cooking?" she asked, surprised. Daniel smiled a little. "I realized something," he said. "I don't think I'll ever eat butter again for the rest of my life. So, I need to learn how to cook other things." Annie almost smiled. He placed scrambled eggs and dry toast on 2 plates and set them on the table. "Sit," he said. "You should eat before school." Annie sat down quietly for a few minutes. They ate in silence. "Is it really over?" Annie asked finally. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. "It's over." "She's not coming back?" Annie asked. "No," Daniel said. "She's not coming back." Annie looked down at her plate. "The house feels different," she said. "It is different," Daniel replied. "Because now no one here is pretending." After breakfast, Daniel asked Annie and her mother to sit with him in the living room. Annie's mother looked nervous, like someone who expected bad news whenever a rich man asked to talk. "Did we do something wrong?" she asked immediately. "If this is about Annie being in the kitchen or talking too much, I'm very sorry. We can leave if you want. I don't want any trouble." Daniel shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "If anything, you and Annie did more right than most people I know." They both looked at him confused. Daniel sat down across from them. "I spent most of my life believing that success was about working harder than everyone else," he said. "And maybe that's true. But the last few weeks taught me something else." He looked at Annie. "It doesn't matter how successful you are if you trust the wrong people," he said. "And it doesn't matter how poor you are if you have the courage to tell the truth." Annie's mother put her hand on Annie's shoulder, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing that this conversation mattered. "I talked to my lawyer this morning," Daniel continued, "and I made some decisions." Annie's mother immediately looked worried again. "If you want us to move out, we understand," she said quickly. "Just give us a little time to find another place. I can find another job." "I don't want you to move out," Daniel said gently. "I want you to move into a better place." She frowned, not understanding. "I'm sorry, I don't. I'm buying you a house," Daniel said simply. "Not a huge house, but a good house in a safe neighborhood near a good school." Annie's mother stared at him as if she thought she had heard wrong. "Sir, we can't accept something like that," she said. "That's too much." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said, "it's not too much. A house is just money, and money is something I have. What you and Annie gave me was something I couldn't buy." He looked at Annie again. "You told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet," he said. "You refused money when you and your mother needed it. You protected me when you didn't have to. That's not something I forget." Annie looked down, embarrassed by the attention. "I'm also setting up an education fund," Daniel continued, "for Annie. School, college, whatever she wants to do one day. That will be taken care of." Annie's mother's eyes filled with tears now. She tried to speak, but her voice shook. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Daniel said. "Just promise me one thing." "What is it?" she asked. "Promise me you'll stop telling Annie that rich people are always smarter than her," Daniel said. "Because that's not true. I've met a lot of rich people who were very stupid. And I've met a few people with nothing, who were the bravest people I've ever known." Annie looked up at him. My mom says rich people don't listen to people like us, she said. Daniel thought about that for a moment. Some don't, he said. But they should, because sometimes the only person telling the truth is the one with nothing to gain from lying. There was a long quiet moment in the room. Sir, Annie's mother said carefully. Why are you doing all this for us? Daniel looked around the living room, the paintings, the books, the large windows, the life he had built. Because a few weeks ago, he said slowly, I almost died because I trusted the wrong person. Then he looked at Annie. And I'm alive because one person decided that doing the right thing was more important than being rich. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the long driveway. People think justice always happens in courtrooms, he said, but sometimes justice is much quieter than that. Sometimes it's just making sure the good people are safe, and the bad people can't hurt anyone else again. Behind him, Annie and her mother sat in silence, realizing that their lives had just changed in a way they never expected. And Daniel Carter stood by the window of his house, understanding something he had never fully understood before. Success is not measured by how much money you make. It's measured by who would tell the truth to save your life when everyone else is being paid to stay quiet. 3 months later, Daniel Carter stood in front of a large window in a different building, looking down at a street full of people who had no idea how close he had come to dying in his own kitchen. Life had returned to something that looked normal from the outside. The company was stable. The board was calm. The lawyers had finished their work. Michael Trent and Victoria Lang were both in prison awaiting trial, their names appearing in newspapers and business journals under words like conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. But for Daniel, normal no longer meant the same thing it used to. His mornings were different now. He no longer rushed through breakfast while reading emails about markets and acquisitions. He no longer let someone else prepare his food. He no longer believed that danger came from competitors or strangers. Now he understood that the most dangerous enemies were the ones who learned your routines, who learned your habits, who learned how you liked your coffee, and when you felt tired. Now he paid attention to people, not just numbers. That afternoon, Daniel left his office earlier than usual and drove to a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away from his house. The houses there were small but well cared for, with trees in the yards and bicycles on the sidewalks. He parked in front of a small white house with a blue door. Annie opened the door before he even knocked, as if she had been watching through the window. You're early, she said. Daniel smiled. I said I would come see your new place, didn't I? He stepped inside. The house smelled like fresh paint and something cooking in the kitchen. Annie's mother walked out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, still looking like she wasn't completely used to living in a place that belonged to her. You didn't have to come all this way, she said. I wanted to, Daniel replied. He looked around. It looks good. It feels peaceful. Annie nodded. It's quiet at night, she said. Not like the old apartment. And Mom doesn't come home so tired anymore. Annie's mother smiled a little. I still work, she said. Just not 3 jobs. Daniel sat down at the small dining table. It was nothing like the long table in his house, but he looked more comfortable here than he had at his own table for a long time. How is school? He asked Annie. Hard, she said honestly. But good. The teachers are nice. They said if I keep reading the way I do, I can skip a grade. Daniel nodded. I'm not surprised. There was a short silence, the comfortable kind. Sir, Annie said after a moment. Are you still scared when you eat breakfast? Daniel thought about the question carefully before answering. Not scared, he said. But I pay attention now. I think about who is sitting at the table with me. That matters more than what's on the table. Annie seemed to think about that for a long time. Frank says the trial might take a long time. Daniel continued. Lawyers, courts, all of that takes time, but they won't be able to hurt anyone for a very long time. Annie nodded. Mom says you saved us, she said. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. That's not true. He looked at Annie. You saved me, he said. All I did was listen. Annie looked down, a little embarrassed. I almost didn't tell you, she admitted quietly. I was really scared. The money she gave me. It was more money than I had ever seen. For a minute, I thought about not saying anything. Daniel nodded slowly. That's what makes what you did important, he said. If doing the right thing was easy, everyone would do it. But it's not easy. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you something. He paused, then added. But doing the wrong thing costs you who you are. Annie's mother sat down at the table with them. I've been trying to teach her that, she said softly. But sometimes the world makes you feel like being honest is just another way to stay poor. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at both of them. When I was young, he said, I thought money solved everything, and in some ways it does. It can buy comfort, it can buy time, it can buy safety. He looked at Annie. But it can't buy a clean conscience, he said. And it can't buy someone who tells you the truth when a lie would be more profitable. The room was quiet again. Sir, Annie said, why are you still helping us? You already gave us the house. You already helped with school. Daniel smiled a little, but there was something sad in the smile. Because someone once told me that success is not about how much you keep. He said, it's about what you protect. And a few months ago, when I didn't even know my own life was in danger, a young girl decided to protect me instead of protecting herself. He stood up and walked to the front door, then turned back to look at them. I built my company from nothing, he said. People call me a self-made man. But that's not completely true anymore. He looked at Annie. Because I'm still alive, he said. Because someone else chose to be brave. Annie didn't know what to say, so she just stood there holding the door. As Daniel walked to his car, the evening sun was low, casting long shadows across the quiet street. He stopped for a moment before getting into the car and looked back at the small house with the blue door. A few months ago, he had almost died in a mansion full of expensive things and dangerous lies. Now he was standing on a quiet street, looking at a small house where the people inside had almost nothing except honesty, loyalty, and the courage to do the right thing. Daniel got into his car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about everything that had happened. The butter, the pills, the money, the lies, the recordings, the police, the courtroom that would come later. And then he thought about a small voice at a breakfast table saying, someone is poisoning you. He started the engine and drove away slowly, the street growing smaller in his rearview mirror. Some people spend their whole lives building wealth. But Daniel Carter knew now that the most valuable thing he had almost lost was not his company or his house or his money. It was the chance to know who he could trust. And sometimes the person who saves your life is not a doctor or a bodyguard or a lawyer. Sometimes it's just the person who refuses to sell their silence. This story carries a quiet but powerful lesson. Evil rarely arrives as a stranger. It often arrives as someone who smiles at your table, someone you trust, someone who says they care. The story reminds us that intelligence, money, and success cannot protect a person from betrayal if they trust the wrong people. But at the same time, it teaches something even more important. Courage and honesty do not belong to the rich or the powerful. Sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one with the least money, the least power, and the most to lose. The real message of the story is this. Doing the right thing will not always make you rich, but it will let you live with your conscience. And in the end, trust, loyalty, and truth are worth more than any fortune. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.